At a time when so many of us feel like our connections with people are distant and conversations surface level, really engaging with each other takes intention. I'm Ashley Gould, the founder of Attend, an everyday luxury home brand with products that set the table for meaningful spaces and gatherings. Our podcast builds on those spaces through dynamic discussions with open-hearted people, with the goal of sparking conversation around your table. In this series, we explore how designed spaces impact our lived experience and day-to-day life. Our aim is to help you understand what makes a space fulfilling and provide a scientific framework along with expert insights to help you create spaces that enhance your well-being. We delve into the entire spectrum of designed spaces, from our brain's relationship with aesthetics to finding the right designers, lighting systems, and objects that support your well-being. Ultimately, we examine how the spaces we inhabit can enrich our ability to be present and connect with others. Join us.
Welcome to episode 4 of the From Brain to Home series. This is part 1 of 2 with Yvonne Jewkes. Yvonne is a professor of criminology at the University of Bath, an honorary visiting fellow at the University of Melbourne. She is the world's leading expert on rehabilitative prison design and a reluctant house renovator. Passionate about the potential of architecture to improve the quality of all of our lives, her research has taken her to diverse prisons, including in Norway, Spain, and Japan. Yvonne has been honored for her role in helping to design corrections facilities in the UK, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand, with 2 prestigious prizes that celebrate the real-world impact of academic expertise.
Yvonne Jewkes, thank you so much for joining me. It's such a pleasure to talk with you after researching your impressive work. I always like to start our conversation hearing a little bit about where you grew up and what kind of kid you were.
Well, I grew up in a city called Peterborough in the east of England, which is very unremarkable. I think I was pretty unremarkable as a child, actually. I think it's hard for me to say what kind of kid I was, because I think I was just very ordinary. I was an only child. And I think if someone had told me what I would end up doing, I wouldn't have believed them. I was quite an underachiever at school. I was quite bright and curious, but I wasn't academic at all. So the idea that I've ended up a university professor, I still sort of have to pinch myself quite a lot most days. And I think, what I've ended up doing is so far from anything I could have imagined. If anyone had told me that actually it would be in this decade that I would have the most creative, enriching, fulfilling period of my life, I just wouldn't have believed it. I wouldn't have thought it possible.
So that's a great segue, because the other thing I really love to hear about is how you found yourself in your area of expertise. So if you could take us to, you were curious and bright, but you didn't consider what you would be doing or perhaps any major aspirations as a child. Take us to how you got to where you are today and that trajectory, and how you sort of found your passion.
I don't know if it's the same in the States, but in this country, we were streamed as children, and I was very, very good at English and very, very bad at maths. And for some reason, the being bad at maths sort of overrode the being good at English. Being good at writing actually carried me quite a long way with humanities and social science subjects. But I always felt like a bit of a dunce because I just could not grasp mathematics at all. But I was quite artistic. The only 2 subjects that I was really any good at were English and art. And I always wanted to be an interior designer. So it's quite ironic that I've ended up designing the interiors of prisons. But I did a degree in English. I just scraped enough, good enough qualifications to do a university degree. And then because I did quite well in that, despite being a fairly lazy student, I thought I'd go on to do a higher degree. So I did an MA, a master's in mass communications research, thinking that I might pursue a career in the media. And I became very interested in television audience studies, which showed that TV watching in the household, before everyone streamed content onto their iPhones and things, it was a very gendered thing. So that, what was decided that was watched on television, it was decided by the male head of the household, followed by the boys, the male children. And last of all came the woman of the household, even if she had paid work outside. And that interested me, that sort of flow of gendered power. And it got me wondering what would happen in an all-male environment, for example, a prison. And it was just through various conversations with colleagues that I became more interested. And I heard anecdotally that TV rooms were flashpoints for violence in prison because one television was shared by maybe 20 or 40 people on a landing. And, I was interested in that, in how it was negotiated, really. But then incel television was introduced, which scuppered my plans a bit. It gave me something different to research, I suppose. A lot of prison officers didn't like the idea of incel TV because they thought that it was too much of a privilege that, prison inmates didn't deserve. But actually, they soon came around to the idea because it meant that prisons were quieter and more orderly than before, because there was always the threat that prisoners could have their TV removed from them. That was quite a powerful thing. And also, they now had an electronic babysitter. They were quite happy to be locked up in cells for longer periods of time. So that was supposed to be a media studies thesis. I decided to do a PhD, and I was kind of touting my proposal around to various media studies departments in the UK. And then someone suggested that I try the Cambridge Institute of Criminology, which has the world-leading prison research centre. That's how I became a criminologist. All of this is kind of amazing to me, really, that has all happened to me, that I found something that I was good at and passionate about. And it all went from there. I remember the first time that I entered a prison. It's quite an awesome and awe-inspiring thing to do when you've never been in a prison before, you've never really considered prisons or prisoners. Just the sort of the smells, the sounds. It was Nottingham Prison, it's sort of old. At the time, it was an old 19th century jailhouse. And it was like the movies, it was exactly what you'd expect a prison to be like. And that was it. It was on my way. And I think, although I don't have a sort of defining moment of when I became interested in prison design, I was immediately impacted by the architecture of the first prisons that I visited. I think it would be impossible not to be, really. And I do think prisons are quite addictive. I've talked to quite a few colleagues about this. I think once you start going into prisons, they kind of get under your skin because they're so full of humanity, in all its extremes. You've got tragedy and pathos and humour, absurdity, it's all there. And it's a really kind of emotionally potent environment.
When do you spend the most time with the people you love? For us, it's at home, around the dinner table with family, or sipping cocktails in the living room with friends. So why not make that time even more meaningful by imbuing your gatherings with pieces that not only make connecting easier, but spark conversation around your table? Amaton's collection of small batch, artisan, quality-made pieces for tabletop and home are not only made for simple serving, they're works of art designed for daily use. Whether you're hosting a dinner party or sitting down for family game night, our collections create a sense of presence and peace in every home. Shop our collection of dinnerware, drinkware, serveware, and more at amatond.com. That's AMEATENDRE.com. Gather by design.
You became a criminologist. Can you just tell listeners what that means? What does that mean?
Well, criminology is often said to be the sort of the new sociology. I think it's booming as a taught subject in universities in the States and in the UK and elsewhere. What it qualifies students for is a moot point. I mean, I think some people study it because they want to become police officers, senior prison officers, that kind of thing. But a criminologist, broadly speaking, is interested in who commits crime and why, who is a victim of, the victims of crime, who are criminalised. My area, because I never studied criminology, so although I teach it now, sometimes I do have to do a fair amount of research. On Friday, I'm going to be teaching about the courts and sentencing, and that's something that I've never learned, so I'm going to have to gen up on it before Friday. I've always specialised in prisons, and that's been my bread and butter, really, for the last 30 years. And I think I've visited something like 150 prisons around the world. I've been to lots in Australia and New Zealand and around Europe, the Scandinavian area, Spain, Southern Europe, and lots in the UK, including Scotland and Ireland.
You talk in your work about the difference in prison design between punishment and rehabilitation. And it's interesting. I actually don't know how difficult it is to get into a prison. I've never been in a prison anywhere. That you say in the United States it's difficult to get into a prison. But in the United States, I think we think of prisons more as punishment than rehabilitation from a societal level. And I know that you have noted sort of the way society or that culture thinks about what a prison should be dictates its design and its function, and perhaps the outcomes as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How for 30 years this has become your sort of the thing that you have spent the most amount of time in your life on, and why? I mean, you say they get under your skin, but I have to imagine you have seen change as a result of your designs, and that drives you. Mm-hmm. So I would love to hear about that.
Yeah, I feel as if I have made a difference, actually, and not just in the sort of the material design of prisons, but in the way that people talk about the design of prisons and the way they think of prisoners. So there's a new kind of lexicon, a new vocabulary around prison design that I think I've really helped to promote. Things like gender-sensitive design, trauma-informed design. And, my book is called An Architecture of Hope. And I think that speaks to the rehabilitative nature of what I think prisons could be and should be doing. It doesn't serve society very well just to lock people up and throw away the key and, to sort of brutalise people through the environment and the architecture. And the thing that I always say is, the vast majority of prisoners will be released, and they will be released back into our communities. Who do we want living next to us? Someone who's been brutalised by their environment, locked in what is essentially an inhumane cage, or someone who's been given a feeling of investment in themselves and in society. And I think, rehabilitation comes with an architecture of hope, which is all about things that most of us take for granted: natural light, space, good ventilation, greenery, green spaces, a feeling of home, a feeling of domesticity. That's a big theme of my book. And it's also the ability to control key elements of the environment, to exercise choice and autonomy over the place that they must call home. Whereas punitive punishment, which you will be more familiar with, it's the architecture of despair. It's concrete, razor wire, clanging gates, the sound of metal on metal, cracked lino on the floors, bars on windows, rats and cockroaches scurrying around rubbish-strewn grounds, no trees, no flowers, so no bees or butterflies. Prisons that are currently being built in this country have no bars on the windows for the very first time in our penal history. And that's as a result of the research that I've done and the presentations that I gave to the Ministry of Justice a few years ago. And at that time, the discussions we were having was whether you could have horizontal bars rather than vertical bars on cell windows, because horizontal bars permit a better view, a better vista through them, like a letterbox rather than vertically. And the answer that came back from the Ministry of Justice at that time was that we could have horizontal bars on the windows of cells for women and children in custody, but not for adult males. And they said that it was very important to have vertical bars because they signify punishment. A couple of years later, I was phoned up by a journalist on the Daily Telegraph here who wanted a comment from me because it had been released from the ministry that there would be no bars on the windows of the new prisons that were being built. And I think this is important to me. It's a small thing, but it feels quite significant. I visited the prisons that are opening now, and, the cells have large barless windows with nice views. There's a fairly recently opened prison called Five Wells that has views from the cells, verdant countryside, a fishing lake, a river. It's beautiful. And the prisoners say they really appreciate that. But I think more importantly than that, it signifies something about us as a society, that we no longer need bars on windows. They serve no material purpose, and that we don't think of prisoners in that sort of atavistic way. I just think it's a civilized thing that has been introduced. And so, yeah, I'm quietly proud of that.
Yes, you should be. Can you tell us, so I would imagine if a new prison is being built, hopefully you're brought in to advise, but many prisons are already built. They're not going to be raised and then rebuilt. So do you have an example of some design changes you've been able to implement for prisons that already existed? And what were the changes? How hard are they to get approved? Because of course they cost money. And can you tell us some outcomes from some of those changes too?
Yeah, I'm very often invited by prison governors to go and look at their prisons and just to give them some advice on quick fixes, that are relatively inexpensive. And often that will be about landscaping, nice planting, softening the environment inside as far as is possible. One prison that I worked with, the Irish Prison Service, Wheatfield, we created a kind of enhanced unit for prisoners that were compliant, that behaved themselves. And it included pot plants and comfy sofas and things like that in the association areas. So it was all about making it feel a bit more domestic, a bit more homely. But that does only tend to happen with the upper echelons of the prison society, and it's used as a sort of carrot and stick, really. You can come to this unit if you behave yourself and you get access maybe to a five-a-side football pitch or something like that. But, the vast majority of prisoners are living in really, quite dismal conditions. And one of the big problems that we've got in the UK is that a large part of our prison estate was built 200 years ago. And, those mid-19th century prisons have thick walls. So, for example, that doesn't enable technology to be introduced, and that disadvantages staff as well as prisoners. Staff can't access the internet and that kind of thing. You very often feel prisoners themselves describe themselves as cavemen living in an era of speed of light technology. But the same is true of prison staff and managers as well. I sometimes despair trying to maintain contact. As you know, I'm writing a book now with someone who is a serving prisoner. And actually the process of communication between us is extraordinarily difficult. So, yeah, things are much harder with prisons that are already built. It's much easier when you're designing something that is immediately fit for purpose, and you can think about concepts such as trauma-informed design and build that in from the ground up. Trying to repurpose an old prison building, especially one that has seen a lot of violence and trauma, it's a hard job.
So maybe you could tell us about one that was built fit for purpose, so a newer prison where you could incorporate trauma-informed design. Can you give us a specific example?
Yeah, I can talk about Limerick Prison, which is the women's prison in Ireland that I've probably had most input into across the whole project. So I was giving a keynote talk in Melbourne in Australia at a sort of prison industry conference. And in the audience, there happened to be the then Director General of the Irish Prison Service. And I was giving a presentation about building humanity into prisons. And the Irish Prison Service had already formulated plans to design and construct a new prison for women in Limerick. And when the Director General of the service heard my talk, he basically said, right, we're going to rip up the piece of paper and start again. And he sent his senior management team to hear me give another keynote lecture in The Hague in the Netherlands. And from that moment on, they were incredibly generous towards me. They put a lot of faith in me. I persuaded them to hold a design competition, which never usually happens in this part of the world. It was more common in Northern Europe at the time. And we shortlisted 4 consortia. And I was involved in the whole process. So I gave presentations to everyone involved, all the prison governors, all the senior staff, the architects and engineers that were shortlisted. I showed them some exemplars from around the world of, good practice in design. And then I was sort of on the judging panel. So we went through this whole process where there was an interim stage, and the 4 consortia came and showed us their initial designs that were partly based on the brief that I'd helped to write and the lectures that I'd given them. We gave them feedback on what they'd got right and what we wanted to see done differently. And then a few months later, they presented their finished designs and we picked the winner. And actually, it was the second most expensive design that won the competition, which I think really illustrated that it was good design, not cost, that was being prioritised. And Limerick Women's Prison opened a year ago in October. It is a radically different design. It's very imaginative. It's humane. It's got a lot of the design cues that I always present as being ideal in terms of maximum exploitation of natural daylight, beautiful gardens, art. There's art and sculpture everywhere. But, those things are only important to an extent. Any prison needs good education opportunities, training, work, transferable skills, that prisoners can come back out into society with. So I believe that architecture is really important. Architecture matters. Our environment is important to all of us. But there are other more important things in prisons as well.
The first episode in this series is with a professor, and he's a neuroscientist. He's opened a center at the University of Pennsylvania on neuroaesthetics. I really do believe, and I think there's growing scientific research to support this, that the architecture and all of the elements you're talking about, the biophilic designs are bringing natural elements in, or the ability to experience them out of windows and art, and all of these things actually have an effect on outcomes. So I think we're growing to understand that the built environment is quite connected to our outcomes. There need to be services and programs and all of these other things, but I think that there is growing evidence that the built environment matters significantly. So it will be really interesting to look 10 years out at outcomes of prisoners at this prison compared to the prior 10 years or century, to see if there can be more concrete evidence that the built environment is producing better outcomes, because that will be a way to get less forward-looking people to adopt these changes.
Absolutely. That's what it needs, really. People want hard evidence. They want a direct causal link between good architecture and rehabilitative outcomes. And that will take quite some evaluation, I think. Again, I just go back to thinking, what do we want to view ourselves at as a civilization, really, and how will future generations view us? So with the Limerick Women's Prison, the women were taken from the old Limerick, which was the second oldest working prison in Europe. It was opened in 1825. Grim, bleak, disgusting place. The women there were held in, they were like medieval dungeons, dark places, cold places. And they were taken over to be shown the new prison, which is light and airy and beautiful. And apparently a lot of them burst into tears at the sheer niceness of it. And, you know, most of those women have had pretty terrible lives. You know, they've been abandoned by parents, neglected, abused, sexually abused. You know, they haven't had good lives. And for a lot of them, prison will be the first place that they can call home, really. It'll be the first place that they've ever felt safe. And of course, there are all sorts of moral and ethical issues tied up in that. You know, do we want to make prisons so nice that, you know, that people want to go there? No, of course not. But I don't want to make the lives of those women worse by giving them a horrible environment, giving them an environment where they're cold, they feel unsafe, you know, which they did in the old Limerick prison. So it's a really thorny issue. But I do believe, and actually the architect of Halden prison in Norway, which is the prison that is always held up around the world as the model prison, the lead architect who I interviewed told me that one of his aims with that prison was to make it beautiful and aspirational, to give prison inmates the message that if they work hard and, you know, make something of themselves, they too can afford and enjoy an aesthetically beautiful environment.
It's so interesting. We talked about how culture and society sort of tells us what prison should be, like what should a prison accomplish. And clearly different countries and different societies value different things. Do you think that it is solely this research, so you build these new prisons that have beauty and aesthetics and light and all of these things, and you collect the data, and that is what it will take to convince other cultures? Or have you seen a cultural evolution in your 30 years? Because I do understand sort of the dichotomy between it shouldn't be a 5-star hotel, right? Like,
yeah.
Criminals are coming to prisons in part for punishment. We want them, or we should want them, to be rehabilitated, but they have, unless they have been wrongly adjudicated, they have done something against our society's mores, right? And there should be consequences to that. So I do understand both sides of this argument. I tend to gravitate to where you do, where let's give them hope, and the title of your book, The Architecture of Hope. But tell us a little bit more about that. I'm sure you've had many, many conversations with both people in government and people who work at prisons and prisoners themselves. I'm just interested to hear a bit more about that dichotomy and what you've learned over your 30 years about it.
I mean, when people commit really heinous crimes, it does test my resolve. And I talk about it in my book in relation to Anders Breivik in Norway, who murdered 77 people and then took the Norwegian state to court, complaining about the conditions that he was held in prison. It's a really tricky one. I don't believe in an eye for an eye, actually. And, you know, I think the loss of liberty is the punishment. So this is something that's enshrined in law in many European countries, this principle of normalization, it's called, that conditions in prison should approximate conditions on the outside as far as possible, because it's the loss of liberty that is the punishment. So people go to prison as punishment, not for punishment or for further punishment. And I think that's what I would adhere to. But it definitely does depend on geography and social norms and mores, as you say. Some countries are just better than others when it comes to believing in the value to society of making prisons more humane, more rehabilitative places. And again, Norway is usually held up in this regard. And in my book, I describe the two most famous prisons in Norway, Halden and Bestowing. Bestowing is the island prison. You can find it all over the internet with commentaries about how it's like a holiday island or something. But I do make the point in the book that those two prisons are unusual. Most of the rest of the Norwegian prison system would be far more recognisable to us. And there has been a move a bit more to the right, to the centre right in Norway. So a prison like Halden will never be built again. It's an expensive prison to operate. The staff costs are high. But I think, there are some things that mark the Nordic countries out as being progressive, that go beyond prisons, strong welfare state. Everyone is better looked after in the Nordic countries than in the UK or USA, I would suggest. So just to give you an example, all life sentence prisoners in Norway, by law, must be able to experience the changing of the seasons because it's considered vital to good mental health. I suspect in the States and I'm pretty sure in the UK that has probably never crossed anyone's mind. And, other things, prisoners can apply for overnight visits from partners and children. There's a great deal more trust afforded them. Prison staff are much better trained in the Nordic countries than certainly in the UK. But there are other aspects of Nordic prison systems that are also quite draconian. So, for example, in Norway, all phone calls are monitored, which means that if you or your family members don't speak English or Norwegian, they can't be monitored by staff, so you don't get to make the call. So I remember during one research project at Halden, I had a Turkish prisoner crying in front of me for an hour because he'd been in the prison for, I think, 4 years by then, and he hadn't been able to speak to his mother in Istanbul because she only spoke Turkish. So I think things like that are unnecessarily cruel, actually, unnecessarily punitive. So, I would rather, if I was an adult male who had been convicted, I would much rather be in a Norwegian prison than in, Wormwood Scrubs in London or in Sing Sing in New York or wherever. But we have to understand that it's still a prison, and the prisoners who I've interviewed there always say, we know that it's called Hotel Halden on the outside, but it's not a hotel, it's a prison, and they will keep emphasising that it's a prison.
Which makes you feel like the loss of liberty is the punishment. Having the nicer place doesn't make prisoners feel like they're in a hotel. They still know. And so, yeah, we should look at the outcomes over time.
You have your freedom taken. I think it doesn't necessarily make much difference to know that the buildings that you're confined in are faced with larchwood, or that the landscape around you has been designed by a landscape gardener. And especially if you're locked in your cell for 23 hours a day because of staff shortages, that happens more than you might think, actually, including in Scandinavia. Another prison, Storstrøm in Denmark, which again I mentioned in the book, which was, again, the architects were really good people. They really believed that they could make a difference and a positive change to prisoners' lives. So one of the things they did, it's a closed high-security prison, and they designed it without a segregation unit, without a punishment block. But as it turned out, it's in an area of the country that is quite remote, and they've struggled to recruit and retain prison officers, which means that everyone is in solitary confinement for a lot of the time. So it's complicated. It's not just about design, it's about the operation and culture of prisons as well.
Let's talk about staff for a second, because perhaps if you have more of these well-designed prisons, it may not be as difficult to recruit and retain staff, because the architecture of these old prisons doesn't just affect prisoners, it affects everybody. Every human who is going there, and if you're going there every day and it's your job, it's going to have an effect on you. And it's going to be a negative effect if it's old, dreary, grim architecture, as you were saying. So I think that's another positive, is if you design these prisons in ways that are more focused on neuroaesthetics, that is not just about making things better for rehabilitation, it's also better for the mental well-being of the staff, and perhaps you could get more staff to view that line of work as important work that they could take on as a professional career for their entire lifetime. And I don't really know anything about how you get into working in a prison or, any of that, but it does seem like it's important work. I mean, all work is important work, and this is important work, and there may be better ways to incentivize it.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? I mean, I think that's part of a broader question about the professionalisation of prison services and making staff feel like valued, professionalised workforces. So I think Scandinavia's got it right in the sense that prison officers do a 2-year degree level diploma, whereas we give our prison officers 8 weeks training, and the entrance qualifications are minimal in this country. So what that tends to mean is that, it's a low paid, low status job, and it attracts people who might otherwise be, I'm just giving a couple of examples of people I've met, but, one came from working in a supermarket, stacking shelves to the prison service. Another used to be a taxi driver. And when I said, what attracted you to the prison service? He said, well, it's warmer than working in a taxi, driving a taxi. So those don't strike me as very good kind of vocational reasons to join the prison service. Surprisingly, what I've sometimes found is that prison officers are quite against nice environments, even though they're their own working environment. So, for example, the Irish prison service had to do a lot of persuading for officers to be taken over from the old Limerick prison to the new Limerick Women's Prison, because some of them just thought it was too nice, that, prisoners didn't deserve that environment. And you're saying, but this is going to be where you're working. It's going to be so much nicer for you. I always start, whenever I start any new project working with prison architects, I always say, look after the staff first, because if you look after the staff, then you're going to have a happier prison and it's going to succeed across the whole range of indices. And, that just means providing staff with good washing facilities, changing facilities, showers, a gym, a canteen. I mentioned the prisons that I helped with the sort of early master planning of. Yes, I'm proud that they have no bars on the windows, but somehow the architects forgot to give the staff a canteen. So they had to repurpose and retrofit a workshop, and it's completely unsuitable. It's got no windows, it's dark, it doesn't make the staff feel good about themselves at all. So, and there's also quite an entrenched mindset sometimes. So with the prison that I helped to design in New Zealand, in Auckland, a supermax essentially, we try to design it to be as humane, as imaginative, as positive, as progressive as possible. So incorporating things like open workstations for the staff so that prisoners could just come and have a chat, interact with them in a normal way. And the staff refused to work behind them until bulletproof glass was put up. We designed day rooms with the intention that prisoners and staff could use them, play board games or have, one-to-one personal meetings. And the staff said, no, we don't feel safe. So it's yet another tricky issue when it comes to the design of prisons. But on the whole, I think if we design for staff first, you break down some of that kind of them and us mentality. So quite often, if I'm talking about technology in prisons, giving prisoners tablets, iPads to order their food on and doctor's appointments and things like that, staff can be very anti that kind of thing. But if you give the staff the iPads first, then they're won over. They can see the benefits to everybody.
So have you heard after the staff moved to the new Limerick prison how they're reacting to it?
I visited just after it had opened, and the staff were very comfortable with their new environment, from what I understood. There is a bit of a sorry tale attached to Limerick in the sense that it was a 50-bed prison. Ireland has a very severe sentencing culture, and the prison almost immediately became overcrowded. So within a year of it opening, it was running at 141% capacity, meaning that prisoners were sleeping on camp beds in cells 3 to a cell. And of course, that's going to undo all the good design intent and make things very, very difficult for staff. So I would love to go back. I think an evaluation is badly needed, but it's a sort of root and branch problem that needs being addressed. It starts with who we criminalise and for what. A lot of those women are in for non-payment of fees, fines, TV licence. They're in for shoplifting, things like baby formula and diapers. We criminalise poverty, especially for women. A lot of them committed their crimes because they were being coercively controlled by men. They were drugs couriers, but forced into it, that kind of thing. So few women are a threat to society, and so few women have been violent in their offences, and most of them have been the victims of far worse offences than they have been sentenced for. So all of that needs addressing, actually, before we even start to think about designing nice cells for them.
And how have you found yourself over time spending your time on policy issues versus on the design issues? I mean, and even talking about the design and the architecture of prisons is fundamentally talking about policy and is fundamentally talking about what does it mean to have a prison, to send somebody to prison? What should it mean? What should our objectives be? And then you start with who should even be there in the first place. Have you found yourself getting more involved in those fundamental issues as time goes by or not?
We had a new government elected last May who immediately started making the right sounds about prisons and saying that prisons were in an even worse state than they feared. They've been chronically underfunded, under-resourced for many, many years now. And so we were all quite hopeful. It seems that the new Labour government are intent on continuing the policies of the old Conservative administration in terms of the prison building programme. I think my message is not a popular one because I think that we should be looking to halve the prison population, at least, if not more drastically cutting it, and then looking at designing fit-for-purpose prisons for the remainder. That's not a popular message for any government. All governments in nearly all countries play to the public gallery. So I think that the real thing that needs doing actually is educating the public. And I think criminology has been quite lacking in that respect. We haven't really penetrated the policy and public discussions as much as we might. Though I was really interested when you said earlier, Ashley, that you tend towards my line of thinking on this, that prisons should be rehabilitative. They should be designed to be nicer environments because ultimately that benefits us all. I suspect that many more people than we might imagine would think that might be the popular public opinion. But in countries like ours, the mass media is so divisive and so hate-fueled, and prisoners are sort of an easy target in that respect. I'm really hoping that both my book that's published, An Architecture of Hope, but also the book that I am now writing with a serving prisoner, will really make steps in terms of eliciting compassion and empathy and understanding in people. Of course, you always face the problem that the kind of people that pick up my book are going to be the kind of people that already believe what I'm saying. Right. I'm leaning against an open door, but, you can only do what you can do, and I'll keep trying.
Well, I think it's absolutely worth it. And the focus of my company, Amaton, to increase human connection in this podcast, to put topics on the table that we don't often talk about. I really feel like when I was younger, we were much better at having discussions about topics we didn't agree on. And we need to refine our curiosity. And when we refine our curiosity, then we don't have to respond. We can just listen. And I think, we need people to just hear what you're saying. That's the first step instead of reacting. And, in the United States, it's poverty and also race. If you look at research on our prison populations, and it's I mean, it's abhorrent. I mean, I think even if you just look at it objectively, but we don't tend to look at things objectively. So trying to get people just to look at the facts, to look at things objectively, and to ask the question, what is our objective? If our objective is to have fewer people go to prison, to have fewer crimes committed, well, I think we can actually all agree on that. And then the question becomes, how do we achieve that? And then we need to look at data over time to see, is what we're doing working or not? And could we consider trying something different and then collecting data on it? We don't have to change the entire prison system. We could start small and collect data and then see how that goes, right?
Absolutely. In my book, I tell the story of, I was interviewed by Fox 13 about the new prison that's opened in Utah. It was the most expensive prison I've ever come across. It cost $1 billion. And the good people of Utah were promised a rehabilitative prison that would do all the things that you've just listed, in terms of cutting crime, making societies safer, so on and so forth. From what I understand, it's been a bit of a disaster so far. I mean, it was knowingly built on swampland, so it's got a horrendous problem with mosquitoes. So the prisoners are refusing to go outside because they get bitten. The prison service doesn't allow them insect repellent because it can be used as a weapon or for self-harm or whatever. They also have really struggled to recruit and retain staff, and they've had to spend more money on it. But the point is, it's a horrible prison. I mean, how anyone could have thought that this design was rehabilitative, it looks to me, I mean, I've only seen film footage and photographs, but it looks like a classic Supermax to me, no sensory stimulation, nothing to pique one's curiosity or anything like that. And when I was being interviewed, I said, $1 billion, that's a huge amount of money. What else could that money have been spent on? Why can't we have a sort of adult public discussion about this issue? What else could we spend that on? Hospitals, schools, public libraries, parks, green spaces. I can think of a myriad of things that might be better ways of correcting people than locking them in these appalling prisons. But, I don't know why no politician is brave enough to stand up and say, this is what prisons are costing you, the taxpayer. This is how many billions of dollars it's costing us. Let's have a conversation about what we could do with that money instead. The rhetoric is just so narrowly focused on offenders are others. They are not like us. And therefore they deserve the most awful punishment we can mete out to them.
Okay, I'm going to ask you about this, and I don't totally understand it, so it'll be really interesting. So one concept you raise in your book is this concept of how too much love is stifling or worse than stifling. And the idea of a facility bestowing love or anything relentlessly is bothersome to me. It suggests force, unequal power relations, no escaping it. I can't think of anything I'd wish to be bestowed on me relentlessly, including love. And then you share a story about a school of children who, subjected to a relentless smothering love, grew up to murder their parents, saying when needs are supposedly met, more monstrous needs will emerge. This kind of, to me, runs contrary to what I think. Like, love is probably the most important thing that parents can give to their children. But I guess this concept that you can overdo it does resonate in some sense. And then I think about, at least prisons in the United States, what's missing from these institutional facilities is actually a lack of humanity, not too much humanity, or a distinct lack of love or caring. But I'm interested to hear sort of what it is you're telling us in this concept and what we can learn from it.
Okay, I was deliberately being a bit provocative in this, but I'll explain my reasons for it. So I was talking about this in relation to a new secure school that's opened in this country, and it's been opened by a charitable trust called Oasis that owns a range of schools across the UK, academies, and they bid for a secure school for children, and they wanted to run it as closely as possible to their normal schools, their normal academies. But they're taking children who have committed very severe crimes and have had pretty shocking upbringings. And there was something in the way that the CEO of Oasis was talking, who's a pastor, he's a religious man, and there was something of the kind of missionary zeal about his early statements about showing the children in this prison relentless love. And I really wish them well, and I make that very clear in the book. You know, they mean well, their hearts are in the right place, they want to do something different. And I was involved in the early design planning of the Secure School of Oasis Restore. But I just wonder if children in custody know how to be loved. Some of these youngsters will have experienced very little love in their lives, and they might find it difficult to assimilate into a group and to be pro-social in that group, and particularly to attach themselves to staff who are offering love in a place that they can't leave. You know, it doesn't matter how nice a place looks to an outsider, it's still a place of confinement. Some will have had their only real source of love truncated by death or separation. Experiencing the death of a parent is 3 times more likely among incarcerated children than non-incarcerated children. And I just ended up thinking that the idea of a facility bestowing love or anything relentlessly is a bit bothersome for me. It suggests force. It suggests unequal power relations. There's no escaping it. And you're right. I can't think of anything that I'd wish to be bestowed on me relentlessly, including love. And I use that J.G. Ballard story, Running Wild, because when I read it, Oasis Restore just popped into my mind. It's about children who live on a housing estate and they all murder their parents. And their parents' only sin was showing them relentless love, but they just kind of felt suffocated by it. So I can't help thinking that Oasis might be in a no-win situation here. It was very badly delayed, the opening. But if just one unfortunate incident occurs, this experiment, which it is, this secure school experiment, might be condemned as too liberal and abandoned in favour of a return to a more sort of institutional brutality of what it used to be, which was called a secure training centre, but something much more carceral in feel. But on the other hand, if Oasis Restore succeeds, our Ministry of Justice might take it as a green light to build further institutions like that, or more likely convert existing institutions. And in turn, greater numbers of children might be sentenced to custody because judges and magistrates will think that they are an inherently good thing. But actually what you're doing is confining them to all intents and purposes a prison. And who knows what effect that's going to have on the rest of their lives. And this is what happened in a Midwestern state of America. My criminology colleague, Judith Shept, has talked about this. Community leaders with leftist leanings proposed what they called a justice campus, where education and training would be offered. But the problem was that judges could sentence young people to custody there with a clearer conscience because they weren't consigning them to a regular prison. And so the upshot was that Liberal local officials inadvertently drew up proposal for the most drastic expansion of carceral control in that county's history. And it went from a very low incarcerating state to a very high incarcerating state. And for me, it doesn't matter what kind of education and training provision is put on there, you're still locking more young people up. And that surely is going to have a detrimental effect, not only on them and their whole lives, but on the lives of their families as well.
Thanks for listening to an episode of On the Table with Ashley. Subscribing to, rating, and reviewing our podcast helps us to continue to record great interviews. So please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. If you're interested in learning more about the products we talked about on the show, visit amattendre.com. That's AMEATENDRE.com to check them out. When you become a member by sharing your email on our website, we'll share special discounts that relate to products discussed on each episode. Finally, email us at reachoutanytime@amattand.com with thoughts you have or ideas for topics or guests for future episodes. Thanks for listening.